So.
Oh, here he comes.
Oh.
There he is. Yeah, I never, when things got changed, but at 7 o'clock, I didn't check back in with him.
Say, or to the.
Recording in progress.
Oh, was he the one that wasn't going to be here? Someone said they couldn't be here.
Okay. I'll call to order the Monday, April 25th, 2022 Planning Commission work session. Should we call roll?
Commissioner Bob LaSalle.
Here.
Commissioner Chris Staggs.
Here.
Commissioner Mitchell.
Here.
Chair Dirk Slottenhofer.
Here.
Commissioner West is absent today. Commissioner Patty Gage is online. And Commissioner Greg Stoll is absent.
Okay. Waiting on Tom. All right. First item on the agenda, work session item 1, traffic engineering 101, and I think we had Aquila was going to introduce this.
Yes, good evening. I'm actually going to turn it over to Josh Wheeler, who's our assistant city engineer, and he will introduce it and kick it off.
Excellent, thank you.
All right, thank you, commissioners, for having us tonight. For those either listening online or those in the audience, tonight we're going to do a presentation of Traffic Engineering 101. And if you have any questions during that time, you can either provide them in a chat window, or you can email them to myself, or you can, you might have to raise your hand. That might be another way. You have to do it online. And then if you're in the audience, there are comment cards that you can write on and ask your questions and bring them up to me. And if we have time at the end, we will give those answers publicly. Otherwise, we'll provide them privately. But tonight, I want to introduce to you first, John Repplinger, who is seated here to my left. He is our outgoing traffic engineer. He's been with the city 20 plus years with his firm Repplinger and Associates, and he is retiring. And so we thank him very much for his service to the city and what he's provided to us. And he is here to provide any input during the Q&A as needed. But we have been transitioning with him with a new consultant from DKS Associates is our new consultant, and our representative from DKS is Rhea Fizikowski, who is here tonight, and she's going to give you a approximately 20-minute or so presentation on Traffic Engineering 101, and then we'll have plenty of time to ask questions after that. So, Rhea, and Jacob's going to get you set up for the presentation, I think.
Yeah, you should be able to use the clicker that's in front of you.
Okay. Thank you, Josh, and thank you, Jacob. Thank you, everyone. Make sure my clicker works. Oregon City Planning Commission work session tonight, and I'll be talking a little bit about transportation engineering and community planning. All right, so just a brief agenda tonight. I'm going to do a little bit of a team introduction so you can meet myself and the staff that'll be helping me. I'll touch base on some long-term transportation planning to provide a little context for that, and then we'll jump into the transportation analysis that goes along with development review.
Oh, the clicker's not working, so go ahead and just let me know when to hit the
Are
slide.
you doing it? Because it seems to be working, but it's not me. Okay, next slide. Can we just say that? Thanks. So the staff from DKS that will be working on this with me, me, Rhea Felizikowski, I'm a senior transportation engineer. I've been at DKS for just over 23 years. I am the on-call development reviewer for several cities in the Portland metro area. I've been doing this for almost 20 years, not quite as long as John. And I'm also have expertise in long-range community planning for all over Washington and Oregon. And then helping me with this is also Kevin Chewick. He is a senior transportation planner. He has 14 years of experience at DKS. He also has a lot of on-call development review experience for agencies all over the Portland metro area. Kevin also worked on your current transportation system plan and your system development charge updates. And he's also worked on several local plans here in the Oregon City area. So Kevin will be a great resource for me for a lot of the background planning work that's been done in the past. And then also helping me is Amanda Daring. She is a transportation engineer that's been at DKS for just over 6 years. Amanda also helps with a lot of development review services, both with me and with Kevin all over the Portland metro area. And she's also worked on several projects here in the city, including the Thimble Creek concept plan. And she's also just starting on helping you review some of the I-205 tolling work that's happening right now. If you guys are familiar with that, they'll be helping with the technical review of that. So I'm happy to have the help. All right, so let's jump into long-range transportation planning. So there are several plans that really inform the policies and the projects that we need to consider here in Oregon City. And starting at a high level, there's the Oregon Highway Plan, and that's a document that's been adopted by the Oregon Transportation Commission. And then there's also the Oregon Transportation Planning Rule, and that sets statewide policies and guidelines that we need to follow whenever we're doing transportation planning in Oregon. And then stepping down from there, Metro has a regional transportation plan that, since we're in the urban growth boundary, we need to follow those. There's various policies and guidelines and procedures that go along with that as well. And then Clackamas County has their own transportation system plan. They have jurisdiction over the county roads, and that'll really influence us when we get into maybe some of the rural areas or some of the edges of the city where we start butting into the county. And then, of course, Oregon City has their own transportation system plan, and that'll really be the main source of a lot of the long-range planning that we look at. So a little bit more background. The city does have a comprehensive plan that has a vision for 2040, and that has some high-level goals of healthy and welcoming community, a diverse economy, a connected infrastructure, and a protected environment. And then from those, the Oregon City Transportation System Plan has specific goals just for transportation. And those include enhancing health and safety for residents, emphasize effective and efficient management of the system, foster a sustainable system, providing an equitable, balanced, and connected multimodal system, identifying solutions and funding to meet needs, increasing the convenience and availability of pedestrian, bicycle, and transit modes, ensure the system supports a prosperous and competitive economy, and also complying with state and regional plans. So those are the overarching goals that we're always looking up to when we're making transportation decisions in Oregon City. So this is a figure that I pulled from your current transportation system plan just to get a little bit of background. This shows what the estimated growth is across the city. And that really comes from the TSP, which we use to address long-range system needs. And then development review, which I'm going to talk about in my next section, that's really when we are reviewing development applications and we're focused on short-term impacts in just a local area. So there are kind of two levels of development. And looking at this figure, you can see the red is housing growth approximated, and the green is employment growth. And those are based on population forecasts that we receive, and then also Metro has land use growth forecasts that we evaluated during the TSP to come up with these. And then, so what comes out of the TSP that we use? Well, there's regulations. The TSP is full of those goals that I read to you, and also several policies that we apply. There are design standards that we need to follow, and then there's also development code that has been written to implement some recommendations that are in the transportation system plan. The TSP also includes projects. There's a very long project list. There are master plans for all modes of travels with priorities. And the projects are just over $200 million that have been identified as needs. And you can see that little pie chart on the bottom on the left that shows how the projects are split between the various modes of travel. And then the TSP also informs us on funding. Based on a projection of available funding over the next 20 years, it's about $73 million that could be applied to the $200 million project need. And that funding comes from gas tax revenue that we get from the state. There's a vehicle registration fee from Clackamas County. There's system development charges that you guys collect locally. And then there's also at times development contributions depending on their impacts. And as you can see on that little pie chart on the bottom right, of that 73 million, about 80% comes from system development charges that the city collects locally. And then the other 20% comes from the other funding sources.
A quick question. I'm not sure if I should be interrupting.
Oh, sure.
But these projects, 200 million, is that to 2035?
Yeah, that's
okay.
to 20, yeah, sorry, yeah. Okay. Yeah, so your current TSP is getting a little bit old, but it goes through 2035. Yeah.
I've got another question on that.
Sure. Yeah.
Is that, are those percentages the number of projects or the cost of?
The number of projects,
okay.
I believe. A good question. You made me think. I think it's the number of projects.
The clicker should be working now.
Oh, you magically fixed it. Okay. Well, there you go. All right. So let's jump into short-term transportation analysis that we do specifically for development review. So we call this a transportation impact study, or a TIS. So transportation analysis is required to provide an objective assessment of potential impacts from a specific land use action, and that can include a development application or sometimes a zone change or a comprehensive plan amendment. So the key questions that we want to answer through this transportation impact study are, will the existing system accommodate the proposed development from a capacity or a safety standpoint? And how will the study intersections operate relative to the city's mobility standards? What on-site and off-site improvements will be necessary to support the development? And are they included in the TSP as a project? How will access to the development affect nearby traffic operations? How will the development ensure safe and efficient circulation, both on and adjacent to the project site? And how will the development provide the needed walking, biking, transit, and driving connections to the adjacent parcels? And I'll dive into these a little bit with the following slides. So the city has established TIS guidelines and procedures that need to be followed. So the general steps through a TSP are, first, we need to determine what is the scope of analysis, and that includes study intersections. And the city's triggers are any intersection where it's an arterial and or a collector that intersect, and the proposed new project would add more than 20 trips per hour to those, then we need to look at that at a study intersection to see if there'd be an impact there. And then we also look at the year that the proposed project is estimated to open. And then also if the project is proposed to be constructed over several phases, we would look at each of the phases to make sure we're now analyzing those separately. And then we also need to determine what the appropriate time of day would be. An example of that, typically we look at the PM peak hour. That's when congestion and the concerns are at the highest. But some trip generation, or some trips maybe looked at in the morning, say a drive-through coffee shop. We'd want to make sure that we're looking at the morning impacts. Schools are special. We always look at mornings and the afternoon when school gets out to make sure we're capturing that. Churches, we'd want to make sure we look like it a Sunday. So that does change a little bit depending on the land use. And then the next step is we evaluate the system performance, and that starts with data collection. So we would count those study intersections and make sure we know the volumes, and that includes motor vehicles, pedestrians, bicycles, transit, and there's also some like heavy vehicle counts that are included in that. And then there's also an inventory of the adjacent system. We need to know at the study intersections, what are the number of lanes? Are there separate turn lanes? Is it controlled by a traffic signal? Is it stop signs on the side street? And then we also want to know, are there sidewalks present? Is there a transit stop nearby? So just so we have a really clear understanding of what the system looks like. And then next, we estimate the new trips from the development. We evaluate the operations at the study intersections. We look to see if there is a need for any new connections. We evaluate safety issues, and then we also evaluate site access. And there's a lot in that bullet, and just so you know, then my next slides, we're gonna dig into those deeper so we can walk through all those and understand those better. Yeah, and then after that, we take the conditions both without the development and then with the development added to see if there's any impact that is occurring when we compare the two scenarios. And then from there, we recommend mitigations to address any impacts if the standards are not met. And this could be constructing off-site improvements, which is typically a capacity improvement at an intersection. You might trigger a need for a turn lane or a signal. Also constructing any improvements along the site frontage. So if the frontage of the parcel doesn't have urban improvements to it, they would be required to do that as well. The curb, the sidewalk, the strip, whatever the city cross-section standard is for that frontage, they would build that. And then they also pay towards any planned improvements, which is paying their system development charges, which is based on the number of new trips they generate. And then if they're nearby an intersection that has another proportionate share impact fee established, we'd also have them contribute to that as well. All right, so let's dig into some of those items I talked about. So trip generation is a big part of doing traffic impact study analysis. We need to estimate how many new trips will come from the development. So we start with ITE rates, or the Institute of Transportation Engineers. They have trip rates that are based on national surveys where they've gone out and collected how many trips are going in and out of specific developments for a specific type of land use. And they have a very large database of trips, and they're used nationally. Then there's also land use categories that for all types of development. And I would say they're pretty good about keeping that updated. The most recent estimate even has, they've kind of shuffled around the different types of residential uses because the residential market and what's coming out is a little bit different than it's been in the past. And then they've also added some new types of commercial businesses that we didn't have before. There's cannabis stores in there now, drive-through coffee shops, things that, maybe 10 plus years ago we didn't see. So they are pretty good about keeping up with the data. And then it's based on development size. Typically that's either the building square footage that they're proposing or it's the number of housing units. And then they provide trip rates for the peak hours that I talked about. Usually it's morning and evening. And then they also have rates for daily trips. And there are some allowable trip reductions for mixed use or for low income. And the mixed use one is if you're building maybe a larger development that has housing and employment or maybe some retail, there could be some trips that are within the site that are happening, but they're not generating new vehicle trips on the street system that's outside of it. Like people could walk from their office to get coffee or something like that. And then below it is just a snippet from a local impact study that was done, and that shows what a trip generation table looks like. So you can see where they've taken the ITE code and matched it. This one says multifamily housing. And they've matched it to what they're proposing, and then you can see the number of units that they have, They've taken a reduction that was acceptable, and then you can see we look at trips both in and out during this one is the morning and evening peak hour, and then the weekday. And that's where we start. And then the next step is determining the intersection volumes. So we need to estimate where the new trips will travel. So we start with looking at local knowledge. I think we know where people want to go, where they're coming from. And if we need to, we can also use the regional travel demand model, and that'll help us kind of determine what some travel paths would be for that area. And then we assign percentages and put them onto the network. So if you see the example, again, I grabbed a snippet from a local impact study. You can see that hashed area shows where the site is, the proposed development. And then you can see there's percentages adding up to 100 that show where those various trips would be going through. And then you can see the study intersections are those circles numbered 1, 2, 3, and 4. And those are the intersection locations that were evaluated as part of this traffic study. So you can see, for example, vehicle trips would be going in and out of the site, and 20% of them come to and from the west on Beaver Creek. So they just get pulled through the intersection so we can see what their cumulative increase in trips would be. And then we also estimate background growth, and that includes what we call in-process trips. And those are any trips from developments that have been approved by the city, but they haven't been constructed yet. So when new traffic counts were conducted, those new trips weren't accounted for because, right, they're not driving yet. So we want to make sure we do layer those in before the development because those have already been approved. And then we also look at trips from any growth that could occur outside the city. So if we get in locations where we're on an ODOT highway, we want to make sure we're accounting for that. And if we're on some areas where we think some growth from the county is coming through the city, we'd want to account for that too. All right, the next element of this is mobility standards. And we use these to evaluate the intersection operations and then to determine if there is an impact. It's going to get a little technical. I think the little graphic on the bottom is helpful for this. So the first thing we look at is what we call level of service, or LOS, and that is based on a measurement of the intersection vehicle delay. So it starts with level of service A, which is a very low delay. You're able to just drive through the intersection. You're really hardly delayed at all. And then it goes all the way through to level of service F, which is very congested conditions. So you can see the graphic on the bottom starts with A. It's kind of a nice, happy light green. And then as you move to the right through the letters, you get to the red, which is level of service F. And then those are associated with seconds of delay that we get out of our traffic modeling. And then the second one is called a volume to capacity ratio, or a VC ratio. And this measures how much capacity is used up at the intersection. And we start from 0, and then it goes up to 1. And it's really just a percentage of how much of the capacity is used. And we are able to calculate the available capacity based on an intersection and how many lanes they have, if it's a stop sign, if it's a traffic signal, and then how many cars are actually going through the intersection. So an example would be, and I'm making these numbers up, but if an intersection can service 1,000 cars in an hour, and right now there's 500 going through it, it's half full, 50% full, the VC is a 0.5. So it's really a percentage. And then as the volumes go up, it gets closer and closer to how much capacity is actually available. It starts approaching a 1. So if an intersection is right at 1, that means it's gridlock, not one more car can fit. So we kind of fill up the intersection. The city applies different standards for different types of control. So there's a standard if it's a signal, there's a different standard if it's unsignalized. And then they also vary based on the location in the city. Metro has some regional transportation plan arterials. And then Oregon City, you also have a designated regional center where the level of service and VC standards are lower, or more congestion is allowed in those areas because they have different density goals in those areas. And just for some local examples, during the evening peak hour, Oregon 212 at Malala Ave and Douglas Loop, which is close to the community college, that operates at level of service D. You guys can picture that. And then Oregon 212 Beaver Creek operates at level of service F. So that might give you a little bit of a local comparative if you drive through those and kind of see how they feel. And again, that's the peak. So that's like the worst of the day. So the impact study would also include an assessment of safety. So we evaluate the historical data, typically the last 4 years at the study intersections. And then that helps us identify if there's any trends in the collision data or if we think there's any safety issues where we would be concerned if new trips were added, that could get worse. And the table at the bottom is a snippet from an impact study that I grabbed. There's several intersections that they looked at. They looked at the crash by type, and that helps us a time to see maybe what we think the collision trends are there, and then the total crashes. And then we also take a look at the access that the development would be proposing on the adjacent public street. The city does have some access spacing standards that we need to look at. These are based on the functional classification of the road, which is really, is it an arterial, is it a collector, or is it a local street? And then they're also dependent on what the fronting land use is, if it's residential, commercial, or industrial. And then once we know what the standard is, we can take a look and see at what they're proposing. There's both maximum, minimum block lengths, and then there's also minimum intersection spacing, driveway spacing, and then traffic signal spacing that we'd want to adhere to. And then we also take a look at site distance at their proposed intersection. And this is just to make sure that vehicles using the intersection can see far enough so they can make a determination if it's okay to pull out in traffic or not. And that's based on some travel speed data on the traffic flow that's going by the driveway that gets collected. And then the engineer goes out to the project site and measures to see how far they can see, and then they compare that to standards. So conditions of approval are the outcome of the traffic impact study. So if new trips are expected to impact either operations or safety, and the standards cannot be met, then the development could be responsible to mitigate their impact. And those are conditions that would have to be met before they could be approved. Common mitigations include off-site intersection improvements, which I had mentioned before. Turn lanes and signals, I think, are pretty common, or roundabouts are becoming more common. They may need to provide a street sub to the adjacent property to make sure that there's ped, bike, and vehicle connections, and they're starting to build out that grid system. And they may need to relocate their access location if they can't meet the spacing standards or the site distance becomes an issue for them. We may have them move that, or their access may also be restricted if they can't meet the spacing standards for full access, or allowing all movements to occur. We may have to limit it to potentially like a right in, right out intersection. And then the conditions of approval need to be proportional to the impact. So we ask ourselves, is the capacity or safety need an existing deficiency? I mean, is it something that's already a problem and the development's just contributing to make it worse? Or is it truly triggered by the new development and the trips that they're adding? And then the thing we really do need to consider is, well, how many new trips is the development, generating that location? And then we also want to consider the level of the mitigation. Is the only mitigation maybe widening from a 3-lane to a 5-lane road? Well, my gosh, that is a huge, expensive, significant type of mitigation that we would have to step back and talk about. Is that really proportionate to, say, the 50 houses that are being built down the street? So we always want to be mindful that what we're asking is appropriate. And last slide, the city also does allow a transportation analysis letter which is a step back. Actually, it's a big step back from doing a full transportation impact study. So it's allowed if these criteria are met, if there are fewer than 24 peak hour trips and 250 daily trips, they can do this. An example of that would be 24 single family homes or building about a 15,000 square foot office. So that level of development, and if we're not expecting any further impacts at intersections operating below a city mobility standard or with a safety concern. So if we feel their level of development's low enough below that threshold and they're not next to an intersection that we already know has a congestion issue, and we know they're not by an intersection that has a safety concern, then we can allow them just to do this smaller transportation analysis letter. And they have pretty minimal requirements. They just need to do the trip generation estimate, which they need to do that to validate that this level of analysis is appropriate. And then they just do an analysis at the access, like I had talked about. We want to make sure that the spacing's appropriate, they have adequate site distance, and there's some good circulation and safety with their site. But they don't need to do a full analysis that would look at any intersections off-site. I think with that, that's it. I'm happy to answer any questions you guys have.
All right, thank you very much.
Sure.
Do any of the commissioners have any questions? Commissioner Mitchell.
Excuse me.
Okay.
I've got a bunch, but
Commissioner
maybe they'll get asked.
Excuse
You can
me.
go first. Sorry. Ms. Richter,
Sorry.
what would you like to say?
Before you take questions, I just wanted to urge the commission and any public testimony to not talk about any specific proposal. Keep it very high level, general. We're talking about how we do transportation studies, not any particular proposal that the commission's considered or may consider in the future. Sorry, thank you.
Okay, not a problem. Okay, with that said, Commissioner LaSalle.
I've been told that the traffic counts are done strictly at lighted intersections. Is that correct or not?
No, we can collect data at any location that we want, and it's pretty routine that we would collect them at an intersection that just has stop signs, either on the side street or all-way, an all-way stop sign. We collect them at traffic signals, at freeway ramps. We collect them at roundabouts. We also, I'm sure you've seen tubes across the road, which gives us like a two-way volume. I mean, it doesn't even have to be at an intersection. So yeah, that's not true. We can collect data anywhere.
And what about the very long stretch of road that's in question, say 3 to 5 mile?
Well, I guess I would want to know the kinds of questions that we're trying to answer before we would determine what type of data we wanted to collect. But like I said, if you
would collect it for that.
Well, I think we'd have to decide at what locations, do we want a daily traffic volume? Are we worried about speeds? And I would also say, besides kind of the traditional way we've collected traffic data, we now have access to a lot of what we call big data resources, where we're collecting it through the Bluetooths on our phone. And we have, years of data that we can look at. So without even putting out tubes, we could evaluate a 5 mile corridor and get all types of seasonal factors and time of day and speed and all kinds of things. Yeah.
So you would just have to be asked to do that by the proper authorities.
Yes. Oh, yeah, if you have a project in mind.
Thank you.
I have a couple questions. One of the questions is related specifically to what we're talking about right now. Another one is maybe a little bit beyond that, but related to traffic. The first one is, I'll start with the one that's maybe broader. What are you starting to see some kind of discussions in the state of Oregon, locally, about autonomous vehicles and that kind of impact that they would have on the future of how we look at transportation?
Yeah, autonomous vehicles have been a pretty hot topic for the last probably 3 to 5 years. I would say we're not sure yet, right? Because they're not out and we really don't know what type of impact that would have. Some would argue that there will be less trips. And then some argue that you're going to go to work and send your empty car home, and then it'll come pick you up later, and there'll be more trips. So as that type of emerging technology comes out, we'll have to be gathering a lot of data so we can make sure that, you know, our modeling and our forecasts are reflecting that.
Yeah.
But right now we don't know because it hasn't happened yet. But yeah, we talk about it a lot, for sure. All the traffic nerds love to talk about, autonomous vehicles. Yeah.
Is it being talked about at the, you know, at the city jurisdictional level with cities specifically? Or is it just being talked about in the industry?
Definitely in the industry. And I think some of the bigger cities that have, you know, some really severe congestion issues, I think it's one of the things they're keeping an eye on to see, you know, is this a solution and are we planning appropriately so when it comes out, we're ready for it? Yeah, but nothing certain.
Right. I mean, one of the projections is that there will be less need for parking on properties, which could dramatically impact the zoning code for cities.
Yeah, and I would add, I think even more so than autonomous vehicles, car sharing right now is making a real impact. And that's a real thing that we do have data on. Because if you do ride sharing, you know, you're taking Uber somewhere, parking's very different. You need a lot less parking, but then we're also finding it's impacting curb management pretty significantly. Because if you're in an urban area and a lot of people are getting dropped off, they typically don't have the curb space. There's already on-street parking. People are double parking. I mean, some downtown cities are finding that they have really severe congestion because of all the double parking during certain, you know, it's a Friday night and everyone's getting out to go to dinner and they have gridlock from that and cars circling to pick people up. And so it's a challenge for sure because there's a lot of this, you know, emerging technology and services that are coming out that we're trying to figure out.
Thanks. You answered both questions.
No? Oh, I did? Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Sure.
Mitchell.
Okay, I got a bunch. And some of those, Mr. Replinger has been nice enough to answer before, but I want to ask him again just to get your spin on them. We only have standards for intersections in Oregon City and not streets. Do other localities have street standards?
Rarely, because intersections are usually the location of congestion, where roadways typically flow fine because there's no interruptions. So the number of lanes and some other characteristics on a roadway will dictate how much capacity, you know, can be served on that roadway, but it's not really a traffic flow or congestion issue. Just looking at a roadway itself, like I said, because there's no interruptions like an intersection.
Okay, so because the problem happens when there's an intersection and cars have to stop.
Yeah, if there were no intersections, you'd get home real fast.
Kind of tied in with that, you mentioned capacity. Where do I know where the ITE generates the trip calculations, or trip numbers. Where do the capacity numbers come from? Like a 2-lane road versus a 2-lane road in the center?
There's several sources. I actually know them by heart just from... But yeah, like typically, and it has to do with access management, how dense the densities of driveways, because driveways, right, can interrupt a roadway. It has to do with the lane width. I mean, there's a lot of characteristics that go into a road. But, you know, typically a 3-lane road is, I want to say 900 to 1,200 cars an hour. I mean, we kind of have our back of our hand number that we start with for a lot of that. But yeah, there is documentation on like what the capacity could be under various they're more like guidelines. They're not standards, but we do apply them.
Okay. One of the lessons that we learned a while back was we can't all get out of Oregon City at the same time. Do any cities have standards for that kind of emergency evacuation situation?
Emergency evacuation. I thought you were going to ask about like demand management or system management. That's kind of a new emerging thing as well. I know a lot of cities that have had issues with wildfires or flooding are starting to look at resiliency planning and what that means. But it's somewhat focused on making sure, you know, if one bridge goes out, you know, can we get out of town, that type of a thing, and making sure that emergency services can get in. But I would say that's something pretty new too. But we're like, my firm's just done a couple recently.
For cities in Oregon?
Mostly California.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think one up, I'm trying to remember, outside Puget Sound area. It seems to be more in rural communities where it comes up, but because of the wildfires and the flooding, I think affects them more.
Okay. So on mitigation, and I know very familiar with proportional impact. So those mitigation ideas, did those start with the developer, and then it's in negotiate? How does that process work?
Yeah, and I can't speak for Oregon City, but I'm getting there. In other cities that I work at, yeah, typically the conclusions of the traffic impact study that's done by the developer's traffic engineer will come up with some recommendations if they've done their job, and they'll show very clearly, these are the deficiencies, and this is how we think it's best to fix them. And so they'll show, oh, the intersection's level service F, but if we add this turn lane, it's level service D, and they can show the modeling output and show that to us. But as the city's representative, it's our job to review all of that, make sure we agree, make sure, right, that we think that is the appropriate mitigation. Sometimes it's not as much as we think it should be. We also need to go look at the TSP and see if it was a TSP project or not, you know, and if that was already a priority that's been identified for the city. So there's a little bit of back and forth, I think, in making sure that the city is comfortable with what the recommendations are and the mitigations and the conditions of approval.
And I'd just like to add in that that is the way we do it at Oregon City too, as Rhea gets up to speed, that the consultant from the developer standpoint provides their solutions to the mitigation, and then our consultant, DKS in this case, reviews that, agrees or disagrees, and if disagrees, says what else needs to be done. So, but it does start at the developer. That is correct, but we have to concur.
Okay. So that's one of your roles as the city's representative, is to make sure that there's enough,
Yep.
that they're doing enough.
You gotta convince me.
Okay.
Yep.
The A through E intersection standards and what we're willing to accept at what time, that comes out of our transportation system plan, right? Mm-hmm. Do we have the authority as a city to decide, you know what, this is not good enough? We're going to, where we may have been willing to accept a level E, no, we want to make it a D. Mm-hmm. Do we have the authority to do that as a city?
You do on streets that are yours. So ODOT has their own standards for ODOT facilities, and the county has for their facilities. But if it's an Oregon City jurisdiction facility, yes, you guys can dictate the level of congestion that you have. But that's a big policy change, right? Yeah, and that'd be a big process that you would want to go through. Because there's a lot of considerations for what that means in different locations, and sometimes there's unintended consequences of changing your standards. It doesn't really fix things like you think they will. But.
And would that be true in that metro designated regional center? Could we change the standards there?
No, sorry. Yeah, the standards that you have, sorry, I didn't mention metros either, but if the metro standards that apply come from metro.
Okay.
Within the regional center and on the regional arterials.
And for those that aren't familiar, the regional center is basically downtown and the north end, right?
Yep.
Okay.
I'm sorry, can I just interject really quickly?
Yeah.
So to clarify the question that you asked, Commissioner Mitchell, those standards can be changed through a TSP, Transportation System Plan process, not per project.
Yes. It would be a blanket change to the standards that are applied to everything.
Okay, good. Thanks for clarifying that. That's what I meant. I was talking about a blanket. I was talking about a blanket change. Okay. Sorry, I'm just trying to keep track of what I didn't ask. Last question. a lot of what you do is number driven. You know, you're doing a traffic count, you're using the ITE chart, making assumptions about which way cars are going to go. And then there's another goal of safety. Because I think a lot of times, most times, I think a layperson is going to say, I don't care what the numbers say, that won't be safe. So how do you balance what the numbers are telling you with safety on that street?
So you're right, there is no standard for safety per se, right? The city can't say, well, if it's a 1, it's okay, but when you go to a 2, all of a sudden, right? We don't really have that. So there is a bit of discretion in looking at safety and what types of mitigations would go with that. And I showed you, you know, we collect data, we take a look at it. We do have some pretty clear analysis that we do. It's not just based on the number of intersections. We look at, we call it the collision rate at an intersection. So it gets proportioned to the number of trips that go through the intersection. I mean, it's not fair to say, oh, there's 10 collisions here, but it serves 1,000 cars a day. And then there's 10 collisions here and it serves 5,000 cars a day, right? So the number of collisions are somewhat proportioned to the volume that that intersection serves. And then we do dig in a lot into the types of collisions. Are pedestrians involved or cyclists? We also look into, were there injuries or not? Was there a fatality? And then we can also look at, are they side swipes because there's too many driveways, or are they rear ends because vehicles are queued because of congestion? I mean, we can tie a lot of the real causes from the data that we see. Like, we kind of know how to weed through that and see what those trends are. And then there's very clear documentation of, well, if we do see a trend with a particular type of a safety issue, what are the countermeasures or improvements that can be made specifically for that issue? And there's a highway safety manual that we can go through, and it's very prescriptive. I mean, if we need to get to that level where we know, oh, this is what's causing it and this is how you fix it. But there is no perfect measure of safe or not. I say, as traffic engineers, we're very careful to not say something is safe or not safe. Right? We have to talk, it's kind of in areas of it can make it worse and we can make it better. And mitigations often can come from a point of safety, but that is somewhat difficult. I think from a traffic impact studies perspective, it's sight distance and that spacing of the new, if they have a new driveway onto a facility, I think is really where we're focused, because we would be allowing a new place for vehicles to enter, right, and exit the public street system. And I think that's the biggest burden for safety, not adding 10 cars to, you know, an intersection down the street.
Well, I've got 2 more questions.
Oh,
I'm
yeah,
sorry.
go ahead.
Kind of related to that, and the particular situation that I was thinking about when I asked about safety, when you were showing your slides, the one that showed the percentages going this direction and that direction happened to be my neighborhood.
Oh.
I live on that map. What's happened is there are 3 subdivisions that were developed in that area. And the particular street that I live on is the commute route for the subdivision that's kind of up behind. And so the street that I live on, even though I'm sure the intersection numbers wouldn't reflect anything too out of the ordinary, the street becomes unsafe at commute times because to the people that live in the subdivision behind, it's not my neighborhood street, it's their route to work. Where is anything like that addressed?
So do you mean what is, like when the traffic studies were done for the new developments, why didn't they look at the volumes on your street? Is that kind of where you're getting at?
Yeah, that's kind of
okay. Well, I would say, and John may have to jump in, I don't know if the city has desirable maximum traffic volumes for certain classifications. No? Okay. So some cities have, and they're just guidelines, but they'll say we want a local street to go up to this many cars a day. And then maybe we have a neighborhood road that's a little higher, and they'll have kind of some thresholds. And then the impact studies can go through, and then they can do an assessment of Well, if we keep adding subdivision here to here to here to here, and they're all going down the same road, they can look at what are the daily traffic volumes that are resulting from all of this growth, and then are we going over a threshold for those? And if you are, that would point to either you need more connectivity. I mean, I think it's really important to have those maximum block spaces, so you're building that grid of a neighborhood, and there's lots of ways for people to get out. You don't want to have everybody funneling to just one location, or you'll have the problem that you're talking about. And then if connectivity can't be the solution, then you start talking about traffic calming. Do we need our speed bumps appropriate? Are diverters appropriate? Are there other management solutions that we can do to either get traffic to go somewhere else and disperse, or to control their speeds? There's a big toolbox for that too.
Okay, so you said we don't have that kind of standard, but some cities do.
Some cities do, yes.
Okay. One more question.
Okay.
We're working on the process of missing middle housing, which is duplex, triplex. Mm-hmm. On the ITE chart, if somebody comes in with that kind of a proposal, let's say duplexes or 2, 3, 4 townhouses, are those considered single-family residence, or is that low-rise multifamily? Because the difference on the ITE chart is pretty incredible.
Yeah. So single family is detached. That's the big word. So those are standalone homes. If they're attached, then ITE has a different rate for that. And actually the recent update did change residential quite a bit for multifamily. I mean, they don't have townhouse anymore. They got rid of that. They don't have condo anymore. They call it multifamily, and I don't have it in front of me, but low rise, middle rise, high rise, they've kind of categorized them differently. And that's based on the data that they've been collecting the last couple of years, because the housing market is changing so much, because of across the country, there's a lot of middle housing infill. That's been a priority in a lot of urban cities. So I would say, yeah, the rate is different, but the data shows that it's appropriate.
Okay. Is edition 10 still the most current one?
11 is out.
Oh, okay.
Like a year ago.
Okay,
yeah,
so I won't
dig into 11.
I won't bring up the numbers that I found then, because it's from 10. That's it. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, of
and
course.
Mr. Rippling, again, thank you for your service to the city, and thanks for being here tonight.
Okay. I do have a question, but I wanted to ask Commissioner Gage if she had something before I spoke.
I do not. Thank you for asking.
All right. Okay, so my question, I'm going to have to ask Ms. Richter first. Can I mention Malala? Okay.
Don't mention any particular development.
Okay, all right. So my question
The street,
is, if,
not the city, I assume.
let's say, hypothetically, 213 in Myers. Okay, let's say our VNC goes over 1 for 2 hours every morning. I'm not saying it is, but let's hypothetically, it goes over. Would that restrict any development in Oregon City, anything that feeds onto that intersection?
Well, first, I would say your VC can't go over 1 because cars, you can't have more cars than fit.
It just backs up.
Sure.
For 2 miles.
Yeah, so you could have demand that's higher than the capacity there. So are you asking, would you have to stop development because
Because it's backing up every morning.
Oh, that's a really complicated question. So a lot of cities do have a location or two where they're getting very close to reaching the threshold, and they likely have an improvement or a mitigation to increase capacity there, but it's not funded. That's typically the issue, right? We know, so I don't know what I'm not familiar with that intersection, but I don't know if it needs turn lane or wide.
It's a signal.
Why? Okay, so it needs more lanes.
So it has to stop. Well, it goes into 213 by Douglas Loop. It goes to Beaver Creek. It just keeps getting worse and worse. But that's the first one.
Okay, well, my first question then is, I guess, I don't know if if there's already a TSP project that addresses that, but typically there's a project that we have in mind, it's just not funded. So then we need to start thinking about how can we get that improvement funded? How can we get development that's adding trips to that intersection to pay their proportionate share?
Right, okay, so the second...
For that improvement, so.
The second part of my question, and it gets more complicated.
Okay.
How far down the road is a development liable for their traffic? Is it 5 miles? Is it 10 miles?
So your standard is if you add 20 or more trips to that intersection, then they are required to look at it.
Would Malala Development have to answer to the trips at that intersection, even though, you know, a large majority of new development in Malala that goes to Portland goes through that intersection, are they allowed to continue developing? Because their traffic's fine 5 miles down the road. Once they hit that intersection, it becomes a problem.
No, yeah, I understand what you're
So
describing.
can they continue to develop with a green light because their traffic is great?
They have their own jurisdiction over their own development. And I don't know of any city in Oregon, this comes up often, that reaches, I know cities that reach beyond their city limits, and into the maybe adjacent county, or maybe like one intersection into the next city. They may have like a joint proportionate share that they know they're both collecting towards. But beyond that, I don't know of anyone that reaches that far out.
Okay, because I know Clackamas, they do their own transportation studies, Clackamas County.
Yeah,
So you think Clackamas County would consider all those numbers and put them all together?
Well, I think it depends on where the development is, again, and what their threshold is for how far they want to track the trips and how far they want to look. So there's a bit of discretion.
Okay, all right, and then that's it for me. And then we did have a question from the public, unless we had some more online. Okay, but the problem I'm having with this question from the public is it addresses specific developments. Well, what do we do at this point? I'm gonna consult with Commissioner Mitchell.
I'm changing it.
We make a generic version of it? Okay, Commissioner Mitchell, can you answer it in a generic?
No, I think I can ask it.
Okay, all right.
In a generic way, and you were just kind of talking about it. A situation where there's an intersection that might be quite a distance away from a development, and it's not the only development that's along that stretch of road. But all of those impacts filter down, or a lot of them filter down to one, say they filter down to one intersection. It's kind of similar to what I suggested about my neighborhood, except strung out longer. You know, the problem intersection is further away. How do we account for the impact at that intersection that might not be right out in front of the development?
So I would say back to, you know, the traffic impact study is looking at the specific impacts of that development. So we're talking about the cumulative effect of a lot of developments, right? I'm assuming collectors or arterials that are further away. When we start to get to that level of analysis, even though we're talking about a short-term need, that makes me think of projects that are in the transportation system plan and projects that are on your system development charge list. And that's why all developments pay system development charges. That's their contribution to citywide improvements that are needed for growth beyond what was identified as a mitigation for a specific development. So I would say if there's capacity issues like that are popping up, I would hope that there would be a project on the SDC list that would perhaps get funded by their SDC contributions from developers.
And in a situation where there may be multiple developments in the pipeline that have not yet been built out, how do you account for those impacts?
So those do get layered in. So you would do a new traffic count at an intersection, say intersection A that we're talking about. And then all of the in-process trips from all of the impact studies for developments that have been approved but not yet built, right? So their cars aren't in that count yet. They get layered on top within the traffic impact study. And then that's what we compare, adding the new development that we're looking at, trips on top of that. So it is incremental. We want to make sure we're keeping track of all those approved trips. So when we look at the new development, it's the real volume that would be there with all of the approved growth that's in front of it. Yeah, so it's definitely a cumulative look, if that makes sense.
Okay, so if there's one that's been approved but not built, now a new one comes along.
Yep.
The new one has to take into account the traffic from the one that has not yet been built.
Yep, they get in line first. They get those strips first because they've already been approved.
Okay.
Yeah, if that makes sense.
To the purpose of that.
All right, thank you. Mr. Josh Wheeler, you had something?
Well, we're at the end of our time, and so I wanted to thank you tonight. Feel free to continue this discussion offline. If you'd like to have future work sessions, we'd be more than happy to schedule those through the planning department. I did want to let you know that there's a small administrative change internally in the city that for numerous years now, the Community Development Department through the Planning Division has been the oversight of the traffic engineering. And we are now taking that on in Public Works in the Engineering Division. And so RIA will be reporting directly to me and my staff. And then I will be working directly with the Planning Division to know what needs they have, when a traffic engineer needs to be present at a meeting, that sort of thing. And so we've been very collaborative in that way. But there's a small administrative change that you'll probably see going forward.
Okay. All right. Anything else before we adjourn the work session? Okay, then we're adjourned. And can we take 5 minutes?